There will be no intro. I'm just going to talk. Lend a Ring, as far as I'm aware, is an initiative to bring positivity to the EXE community. This is important to me because I actually supported this initiative. I respected the values it represented, and with the constant drama that happens in this community, I too agree that we needed the positivity. Full disclaimer, I am not making this video to seek clout or take advantage of the drama. I actually care about this community. I've been in this community since it first began, so I feel obligated to share this document with you and read it in full. I will not share any opinions. I will not give my thoughts on this. All I'm going to do is simply read. From this point forward, none of the words that come out of my mouth are mine. Introduction. This document has been organized and written by myself. All sources of evidence provided via personal account and screenshots have been directly provided by Neb J316 and myself. For the sake of privacy, the only altercations made within the screenshots provided will be clearly indicated by a black bar with a red outline and will only be used in the censorship of real names and any personal information of TBM, Neb J316, and myself. The same method of censorship will also be used to protect the online identities of any other people mentioned within this document in order to prevent any unwanted harassment and hate towards anybody indirectly involved. Synopsis. This document serves as a condensed form of the material gathered by this document serves as a this document serves as a condensed form of the material gathered that is intended This document serves as a condensed form of the material gathered that is intended to directly uncover things that TBM has done, specifically actions that he has intentionally attempted to sweep under the rug in order to avoid accountability. This includes, but is not limited to, the continuous emotional manipulation and inappropriate relations TBM initiated with Breeze/Luna over the course of their year-long relationship. When Breeze was 15 and 16 and TBM was 18 and 19. Brief purpose statement. No one involved in the making of this document desires any sort of apology or acknowledgement from TBM himself that he feels remorse for the things he has done. The time for that has passed a while ago, and the grace and the compassion we once held for him as a friend is no longer present. The intention of this document is to spread awareness of the person he is and what he has done to people he once considered day ones. Nope. And is in absolutely no way intended to bully or harass him or anybody else that may be mentioned. I personally have been extremely busy with my transition from high school into college, and this entire situation has mentally and emotionally drained me in ways like nothing else before. Being forced to relive these moments and come to terms with the fact that I was physically taken advantage of as well as piercing together all the unfair ways others were treated has been nothing short of sickening and is what led to the creation of this document in the first place. I pride myself on being a forgiving person and advocate for giving people second chances, but TBM has taken advantage of this grace too many times to count in the past. Now that I am older and more knowledgeable on the reality of what happened, I cannot stand idly and simply hope he does not do these same things to another person and continue to get away with it. I have absolutely nothing to hide and will openly acknowledge any shortcomings both in the past and the present that I may have potentially showcased, and I assured everyone reading this that I, along with Neb and J316, have absolutely no reason to lie about anything contained in the following tabs. The deliberate attacking harassment of anyone within the document is not supported and is looked down upon and will not be tolerated by any means. I have known TBM since Amino was still up and running back in 2021, when he went by the online alias Shade or Mr. Shady. During this time, he was already in an ongoing online relationship with J316, whom I was not initially close friends with. At some point during the Amino era, we became fairly close with each other, and he eventually told me that he had developed romantic affections towards me. I did not reciprocate these feelings, however, and told him that one of the reasons I was turning him down was out of respect for J316, since they were actively still together at this point. TBM had never told J316 about this attempt to get with me behind her back, and she still never found out about it until a couple of months ago when I briefly mentioned it. TBM and I remained in contact afterwards through both Amino and Discord by the year 2023, and he began reaching out more frequently again, mainly on Discord around the 25th of February 2024. It is also important to note that TBM actively cheated on J316 two times before anything under the before TBM and I dated header took place. On the 28th of February, TBM reached out to me to talk to me about his relationship with J316 and the possibility of them potentially breaking up 2 hours after he discussed with J316. Since we shared the same religion, I told him that I'd keep both of them in prayer. Later in the same conversation, the earliest record I have of TBM mentioning seeing me in person. On the 29th of February, TBM looks back and discusses potentially seeing me again in more detail. I mentioned the idea vaguely to my father, as stated, and he did not feel comfortable with me meeting with someone I knew online, understandably so, considering I was 15, couldn't drive, and was still in school, and TBM was 18. March 2nd at 11 a.m. was the earliest instance in which I had assumed TBM liked me romantically, and I was later proven correct in this assumption. Here, he explains himself vaguely in an attempt to temporarily mask this reality to me, but it was clear to me that he was referencing the time on Amino where he had first developed feelings for me. I had assumed this especially because of the statement, and this isn't the first time either. At this time, TBM and J316 hadn't broken up, and I initially did not want a repeat of what happened back on Amino to take place again. Around the same time that day, TBM told J316 he had no doubt in the strength of their relationship and was confident in staying with her on his end. March 3rd, TBM and I had a conversation that rubbed me the wrong way for the next 3 days. The way he spoke to me made me weary of talking to him in general, but because of his situation with J316, I said nothing to him about it and tried to move on. On March 6th, TBM reached out to me at 7 a.m. asking religious questions about his situation with J316 again, plus his passing comment about having something else catch his attention lately. If his relationship with J316 were to end, talking with his affections for me that he had not yet directly told me about yet. On March 6th, TBM called me with the intentions of simply hanging out. I don't recall the entirety of what happened in the call since it lasted for a few hours. However, at some point, TBM ended up screen sharing YouTube and telling me about his interest in songwriting. He then pulled up an instrumental track to start spitballing to as a demonstration for his passion. This ended up being the main form of communication for the majority of the rest of the call, as in TBM talked to me and communicated thoughts he had to me through freestyling, which was honestly very awkward for me at times. Eventually, he insisted that I try for myself, to which I politely declined out of embarrassment. I told him that songwriting was not a creative passion of mine, and that the idea of attempting to freestyle made me feel awkward. Despite this, TBM picked a soundtrack to play on loop for 30 minutes without saying anything, in hopes that I would indulge him anyways, when I inevitably didn't because I felt embarrassed for being put on the spot. He resumed freestyling himself, and I vividly recall him sounding very dejected and essentially telling me how he felt awkward and dumb in attempts to make me feel bad for not participating despite my clear prior communication of feeling uncomfortable with it. So I reluctantly played along at last, and it sort of turned into me venting about my home life. TBM responded by telling me he personally understood how I felt and that he suddenly felt as if he could help me. His telling of his new idea, he very cryptically asked me out and essentially promised to me that he would help me with my issues, but only if I let him. I was silent for a while, trying to process what he was asking me, and was ultimately hesitating on answering because the way he had spoken to me on March 3rd was still not sitting right with me. When I didn't immediately answer, TBM spoke again with the same dejected tone as earlier, which made me feel bad. So without thinking, I said yes, and his entire demeanor changed to one of pure excitement. Right after that, TBM told me that he wanted to immediately call Neb to tell him what had happened. We briefly did so and then returned to our DM, where TBM told me that he had messaged J316 as well to tell her that we were now dating. The following screenshot was taken from J316's end and is what TBM messaged J316 here. He had essentially broken up with her, and they agreed to stay friends but he had not told her that he had asked me out or that we were then dating. Please be aware of the 6 hour time zone difference, which is why the date may appear backwards, and the time of the screenshot doesn't line up with the previous one. After TBM told me that he had messaged J316 and told her about everything, TBM immediately started telling me that he loved me. Afterwards, we ended up hanging up and I went to sleep since I had school the next day. On March 8th, TBM had once again brought up the idea of seeing me in person without my parents' knowledge. I was at school when he did, and I had mentioned it to someone I was friends with at the time. She suggested going bowling, and she offered to take me so she could also meet TBM. The following is how that conversation went. In the phone calls TBM and I had about this meetup, TBM had at some point introduced the idea of us potentially kissing. He proposed the idea of sneaking away from my friend with an excuse at some point and finding a family bathroom to be alone with each other in. He went on to explain his vision of how it would happen naturally and him being overall excited. On March 9th, TBM and I met in person along with a friend of mine without either of my parents' knowledge. The following screenshots are of the communication between TBM and I just before we met. Next, I will go over the many things that took place during this time. I have multiple written personal accounts of what happened during different times, and I will go over the entire meetup here. A brief reminder that during this encounter, I was 15 and therefore under the state's legal age of consent, and TBM was 18. When my friend and I first walked into the building, TBM came up behind me to surprise me and then hugged me. We checked in and claimed a bowling lane, and things were fairly normal for a while, as we all took our turns bowling. TBM eventually became bolder and got more touchy with me when my friend's turn was next and she wasn't paying us any attention. Two things I vividly remember happening are as follows. A recurring instance of TBM grabbing me from behind and pulling me down to where he was seated on a chair. The first time he did this, I resisted a little and laughed it off, but he persisted. It seemed to me as if he was trying to get me to sit in front of him on the same chair. However, there was definitely not enough room for me between his legs, so as he pulled me down, I shifted so that I land on his knee instead of in between his legs. I remember I felt extremely awkward and barely placed any of my weight on the table in between my turns so that he wouldn't be able to continue doing so. The second thing happened once, and I remember feeling extremely anxious about it as my friend had walked away to take her turn. TBM and I were talking when he had suddenly leaned in towards me. Both of my hands immediately shot out and planted on his shoulders to stop him from leaning in any closer. Because I was initially scared he was trying to kiss me. TBM looked at me like he was shocked, and I once again laughed the moment off because of how awkward I felt. After our time was up on our lane, we made our way over to our dining area and ordered food for all of us. My friend got us a table, and after a while, TBM asked me if I wanted to go walk around, and I agreed, and took my phone, and asking my friend to text me once our food was done if TBM and I hadn't returned by then. TBM then led me outside and around the side of the building. To the right of the building was an open, grassy area in front of a wooded area. He led me away from the building and to the clearing right where the tree line began. He sat down with his back against the tree, and it looked like he wanted me to sit on his lap. I was already extremely anxious, and the thought of doing anything beyond our hug earlier was not appealing to me. Instead of sitting on his lap, I ended up awkwardly sitting between his legs, hugging him in what I can only describe as an attempt at cuddling. After a while, however, TBM grabbed me from underneath my shoulders in an attempt to pull me up tight and sit on his lap, and I relented. This moment was especially awkward for me because TBM was just staring at me for a while, until he eventually leaned in to kiss me. I did not kiss back initially because I was frozen in shock, and I just let him kiss me. However, after a couple of seconds, I attempted reciprocating because it felt like he was just putting his mouth on my face. This evolved to a lengthy makeout section, and as he got more comfortable, his hands began to wander my body. Again, I was frozen in shock because I didn't know how to react, and I was too nervous to stop him in any way. He unbuttoned my jeans and untucked my shirt so that he could feel the skin of my stomach. He then felt up my torso and groped both over and underneath my brawl. At one point, he started messing with the clasp of, but then moved on and moved his hands towards my rear. There were only two instances where TBM asked me if I was okay with what was happening. The first time was when his hands went to my hips where the waistline of my jeans were, in which I thought he was asking if holding me there was okay. I nodded, and then he proceeded to stick his hands underneath the fabric of my jeans and underwear to grab my rear once again. I was too anxious to say anything, so I just let him continue touching me as he groped my behind. He as he groped my as he groped my behind, he did also suddenly started pulling me to rock against him for a while. He eventually went back to grabbing my stomach, and then finally things calmed down as he just held me in place on his lap. At some point, I recall him asking me if there was anything else I wanted to do, to which I responded with no. He then replied with something on the lines of good, because then we would have to have move on further into the forward. It was around this time that I checked my phone and saw that my friend had texted me a couple of minutes ago. I told TBM that the food was ready and that my friend was asking where we were since I hadn't responded to her yet. He told me that she could wait a little longer, and so I texted her saying we were on our way. Shortly after, TBM ended up having me get off of him and laid on the ground on his back and asked me to lay on top of him. I hesitated, but ended up awkwardly crawling over him, hiding my face against his shoulder and facing away from him. However, he ended up turning my face back towards his to kiss me again. It was after this brief moment that he decided we could go back to my friend. The three of us ate together and talked about mundane things until my friend's parents came to pick me and her up after I went home. After I went home, TBM texted me about some of the things that happened. On March 10th, I decided I was going to tell my parents about my relationship with TBM. I did not tell them about the meetup on the 9th yet, but they did eventually find out about it without knowing the details of what we did. I texted TBM before I told my parents, and he responded by telling me to lie about his age. On March 11th, TBM had finally messaged J316 and told her that he was dating me, almost 5 days after he originally told me that he already told J316 of this information. The following screenshots were taken from J316's end, and this is what TBM had messaged J316. Please be aware of the 6-hour time zone difference. Also note, TBM was fully aware that I was 15 and lied about my age in this particular screenshot, since J316 was not familiar with me at this point of time. TBM ended up visiting me multiple times over the course of our relationship, and every time he visited, he would come up with ways to get me alone with him so that he could grope me and make out with me. A lot of these instances blurred together for me because of the repetitive cycle. However, there are a handful of situations that I have written accounts of because of something significant happening on those days. I also have written accounts for some inappropriate moments I recall happening over FaceTime calls, recollections of generalized weird behaviors that echo how TBM used to treat J316, and extra screenshots of TBM being sexual or weird towards me over text. The written accounts will be in no particular order after the screenshots. Early on in our relationship, TBM had told me one day over the phone about a $20 bet one of his friends put him up to. This being that TBM would get the $20 if he could risk someone up. So TBM told me that for a few days he had been talking to 3 other women on Instagram in an attempt to get one of them to essentially start liking him so that he would win the bet. I was extremely upset by this, but I didn't say anything about it because I did not want to make it into a big deal. About a week or so later, TBM brought this situation back up to me and told me that he was surprised and didn't know what to do once he found out that they had inevitably actually started crushing on him after he deliberately led them on for the bet. I never asked about it past this because I tried to forget about it and move on. TBM frequently made it clear to me that he was into fat girls and would tell me about the dreams he had of me showing up to his place barely wearing anything and 500 pounds heavier. He was also generally obsessed with my stomach and would ask me for pictures. I used to send him videos of me just talking about my day, and I remember once I was wearing a sort of tank top and sweater that wasn't fully zipped up, and TBM would only comment on my cleavage. One night, he was in a Discord server voice chat with some friends, and I believe they had just started playing some games together. Seeing this, I texted him instead of calling him, saying something along the lines of, "Hey, I'm going to bed in a few minutes," since it was a school night for me and it was already fairly late. He left the voice chat and called me as soon as I had texted him and was basically moping about me going to sleep. I told him that he didn't have to go to sleep with me and that if he wanted to go back to the server to hang out with his friends, that I had absolutely no problem with it. However, TBM insisted, saying since I was going to bed, he also had to go to bed as well. Again, it was already late, so I didn't bother going back and forth with him. The next morning, I woke up around 6 to start getting ready for school, and TBM was awake as well because he had to get ready for his job. And he proceeded to just absolutely go off on me. He told me that I needed to be more aware of my actions because I control what he does. He continued by telling me that when I texted him, he had just gotten on VC with those people and that he hadn't spoken to them in a while and that he had to leave because of me. I vividly remember at some point in the middle of our relationship, TBM and I were on the phone like we normally were, and at some point we got to the topic of what would happen if we broke up. And TBM told me that if I ever broke up with him, he would genuinely kill himself. And so when I did eventually break up with him, we were on the phone that day. So when I did eventually break up with him, we were on the phone the day after, where he told me he had stood at the balcony for a good few hours contemplating it. I don't remember the reason he told me as to why he decided against it. However, the night of me breaking up with him, he seemed to be taking it fairly well and went as far as to start calling me little sis. So that sharp difference in his demeanor startled me. When he called me the following afternoon and essentially told me he needed space, I respected his desire and reached out to him less to give him the room he asked me for. A week or so after, in a group call, he asked me why I had been so distant with him. I told him that it was because he told me that he needed space, to which he proceeded to tell me that he had completely forgotten that he had told me that TBM also openly admitted to masturbating over FaceTime calls without my knowledge. The, 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 there was one time where he was in his room and he had his phone camera placed upwards towards the wall behind him where his bed was pushed against, so all I could see was the top of his hair and the shadows on the wall from his silhouette. At some point I noticed some weird movement from the shadow, but I obviously had no way of knowing what was happening, so I ignored it. But then out of nowhere, TBM spoke up and sort of nervously asked if I had seen that. I played dumb at first and asked what he was talking about, and he brushed it off and told me it was nothing. However, less than a minute later, he told me that it was. He told me what it was, anyways, without without me asking, and then admitted that it wasn't the first time he had done so while we were on the phone. The second time I remember knowing about this happening was one morning. Again, we were on a FaceTime call, and I was wearing a bra and biker shorts, so other than my cleavage, there wasn't very much. He then started poking fun at the idea of me revealing more to him at this point in our relationship. He had already asked me for pictures of my stomach, and I told him that I and I and so I told And so I told him that all I probably do is fold the taller band of my shorts down a little. I did this and he started complaining and said, "Yeah, but I've already seen all of this." And then he deliberately told me to pull them all the way down if I was going to actually do anything at all. So unfortunately, I did. Which left me just in my undergarments, and and then the call went silent for a while. Eventually, TBM spoke up after a while, only to tell me that he was actively. One time, TBM was visiting. My family went out to this big park with a few walking trails and grilling spots. I recall TBM repeatedly telling me to ask my parents if the two of us could go walk one of the trails. I kept making excuses not to tell my parents, lightheartedly saying that they would most likely say no, etc. However, TBM kept pushing, and so I eventually asked, and they said we could. However, TBM kept pushing, and so I eventually asked, and they said we could. Once we were about halfway through the trail and deep into the forest, he walked me off the trail a little bit until he found a spot that was hidden from view. Here, almost the exact same things he did to me when we first met to go bowling, he did again, that being him groping my chest and rear while kissing me. um, once when we were sitting with each other in the dining room of my house watching Instagram reels on my phone, he stuck his hands under my hoodie and bra from behind to grope and pinch my chest. And I had to pretend as if it wasn't happening at all. All because my mother was sitting across from us in the living room, albeit not paying attention to us and watching a movie. This specific scenario happened 2 times. The first time was when one of my parents was driving TBM to. The first time was when one of my parents was driving TBM to a nearby hotel he was staying at. I was in the back seat next to him, and TBM was in the seat against the right door. Around halfway through the drive, he took one of my friends and then placed it on his crotch. I froze. I had no idea what to do. He kept his hand over mine for a while and then pressed my hand down harder against him. When I still didn't move, he eventually took my hand off of him. Sometime after he was back at his place and we were on the phone, he brought up that night asking me what I'd do if he were to do it a second time. I laughed it off and told him I didn't know. The second time it happened was very similar. Same seat position, same scenario where one of my parents was driving him to the hotel he was staying at. This time, however, he didn't hold my hand down against him, I guess to see what I would do. And after I did not move once again, he was quicker about taking my hand away and adjusting himself. Later that week at my house, I was in the middle of doing dishes, and TBN was in the kitchen as well, talking with me while he watched me. At some point, he mentioned that night, made a joke about it, in which he grabbed something cylindrical shaped and held it towards me, telling me to grab it with a weird smile on his face. I understood quickly what he was implying and just awkwardly stared at him. He laughed when I didn't move to grab the object and teased me for it. Another time we met IRL, he was taking me to see a local event alongside two of his family members. The first thing we did to burn time before the event was stopping at a nearby mall. We all ended up going our separate ways with a time to meet back together to go to the event. TBM ended up walking around with me and told me that he was looking for a family bathroom since there wasn't one at the place we had gone bowling at our first meetup. Once he found one, again, the same things happened. He had me sit in his lap and then kiss me, and I can't read this. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I can't. I can't read this. I can't. I'm sorry. Oh my god.